Okay, hello and welcome to this last video in the GCSE Biodiversity and Ecosystems playlist. Not only that, this is typically the last lesson in the GCSE. So if you're going through in a fairly typical order, this is the end of your GCSE. You now know everything that is in the spec, and well done to you. So today we're going to talk about whether or not there's a role for technology in some of the food problems that we've laid out in previous videos. So obviously talking about population, talking about food production, talking about efficiency, talking about rising wealth and luxury foods, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is the bit of spec that we're talking about, the idea that you should be able to describe and explain some possible biotechnical agricultural solutions, including GM, to the demands of growing human populations, the idea that techniques enable large quantities of microorganisms to be grown for food and cultured for food in big vats, things like mycoprotein, Fusarium, famously the brand is Quorn, that you may well know, protein-rich substitute for vegetarians. Is that an advantageous thing, not an advantageous thing, so on and so forth. And the fact that we also use genetic modification, not just in food production, but also in things like medicines, okay, genetic modified organisms to produce medicinal products like insulin. And then the example down at the bottom there is one for nutritional benefits, which is the so-called golden rice example, which is a really good example of what we're talking about when we're talking about GM crops helping people around the world, okay? So, what's the problems then? Well, in the previous videos, you should have all seen that we've got various food problems from an increased population, increased wealth of that population, so they all want to eat more, better and more luxurious food, and why wouldn't they? We've also then got this issue in this country, in developed countries, that we're getting less and less knowledgeable about the food that we eat, where it comes from. Okay, so the idea is, can technology help us? Are there sort of technological solutions, and can we use technology in the production of our food? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. Yes, of course we can. We're already using huge amounts of technology in the production of our food. If you go to any farm, any food producing place, there's masses of technology, from mechanization to various biochemistry to medical and veterinary sciences, and obviously genetic technology that we're going to talk about is just the next thing. But unfortunately, when you talk about GM crops, you tend to sort of get this kind of image in your head. And this is a lot of people think about GM crops. They think, oh no, we can't do that. We're messing with nature, and people get so angry about it. They do stuff like this. They'll break into experiments, GM crop test sites, and just destroy scientific experiments. Okay, now obviously it won't surprise you to know I'm not a particular fan of that course of action. Okay, so organisations such as Greenpeace, for example, who I have a lot of time for in a lot of things they did. If you watched the last video about marine protected zones, I think on GM crops, they're probably not in the right, okay? And people who break into any scientific institute and destroy things probably are not in the right on that front. So what's the problem? Why do people get this idea? As soon as you say GM technology, that's not okay, or we don't like that. But any other sort of mechanization technology in our food production, we're quite happy with that in terms of efficiency and all that sort of stuff. It's a very weird sort of dichotomy. So this is basically where we get to perceptions, because quite often when you think of GM crops and things like that, you think of people in labs looking like this, in a lab coat. Oh, what's he doing there, that guy? Oh, look at him there with his microscope, right? And he's got basil and peppers right there. What's he going to do? Is he going to make some kind of unholy sentient salad? Oh, look at him with his microscope. Why is he wearing a mask? Oh, he won't even breathe near that food, and he expects me to eat it. That wanton basil botherer, right? Look at him there, right? Whereas when you talk about things like organic food and farm shows, you get sort of a very different image in your head. They go, oh, look at this. We really like this. Look, all the food's in wicker, which must mean it's really good for you. Everyone likes wicker. Wicker is great, right? And look, this lady here, she's got a sign. Right, she's got a sign, and it's a chalkboard. It's proper old school. It's got a chalkboard and chalk, and it says organic on it. So that must be good. We must want that, right? That's really great. So quite often people get the idea that this kind of image of food production is scary. In fact, that's a very obvious staged picture that I found when I searched for GM crop scientist or something like that. That obviously is the image people get, and it's very scary. Whereas this is generally accompanied by the word natural, right? Oh, it's natural. Got to have the natural things. Well, I have a problem with the use of that word in this discussion, okay? And we're going to try and be a bit more scientific in the remainder of this video, because natural things include crocodiles, Ebola, and COVID, right? It doesn't mean you want them in your soup, right? Just because they're natural. Unnatural things include iPhones and houses and modern medicine, right? So just saying natural doesn't necessarily mean good. And for your purposes, certainly for examination purposes and for any sort of discussion on this, you mustn't use that term natural, right, when an actual scientific answer is required. So let's look at what we mean by GM, okay? Genetic modification is a technology that involves inserting DNA into the genome of an organism. To produce a new GM plant, usually new DNA is transferred into plant cells. Usually cells are then grown in tissue culture with developing plants, and the seeds then will inherit the new DNA. That's the definition from the Royal Society, links in the description as ever. But if you look at that description, it involves inserting DNA into the genome of an organism. When you think about what farming is, right, you think about what agriculture is, well, farmers have been doing this for generations, right? The minute you start saying, well, this cow should breed with this cow, and this, I'm going to cross this plant and the pollen onto this plant, you are deciding as a farmer, as a food producer, which genes are going into the next generation. You are doing genetic engineering. And the only difference that I can see, the only substantive difference that I can see that makes people go, whoa, is that people must have a fear of lab coats, right? It must be lab coats. Right, because if you're outside wearing overalls and you're out on a farm with a fork, right, or putting animals in a field together, right, and going, go on, spread your genes between each other, right? Everyone thinks, oh, that's lovely, that's fine. The minute you put a lab coat on, that's very scary. Okay, so I would encourage you not to have a fear of lab coats. I spent many years of my life in a lab coat, and I can tell you most of the other people in lab coats are the most timid, lovely people you will ever meet. They certainly don't want to make carrots come alive and leap up the toilet at you, right? They don't want to do that. Okay, so it's probably just a fear of lab coats. So let's go a little bit more into what we mean by examples of what genetic technology can do for us. Okay, and here's one example that's straight off the spec, and it's probably the most famous example. So lots and lots of the world population subsist purely on a diet of rice. This is unheard of in the Western world, but vitamin A deficiency causes huge amounts of illness and death in children around the world. Okay, and you can look at the papers in the description, the links in the description. But 670,000 children a year are dying from vitamin A deficiency. That number may have changed since that Lancet article in 2008, but it's still a very large number, and it blinds. Lack of vitamin A blinds 500,000 children per year, or gives irreparable sight defects to that many children. That's from the World Health Organization, right? That's a lot of people, and this is very easily fixed by giving them vitamin A, right? Obviously, the best thing to do would be to have a balanced and broad diet, but these are people, poor farmers living in poverty, all right? So therefore, they're really subsisting on rice. So what golden rice is a variety of the rice plant that's been engineered to produce some of the same things that a carrot produces. So beta-carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A and a precursor to the light-sensitive pigments in your eye, so called opsin and rhodopsin, right? If you can engineer this in, then you eliminate the vitamin A deficiency and you eliminate the blindness and the deaths associated therewith for people who are only eating a few bowls of rice every day. Okay, that obviously is a brilliant bit of science, a brilliant opportunity. And you can see down here we've got the normal rice down here, and then over there that of course is the golden rice, which has got that same sort of orangey colour you find in a carrot. Okay, the other thing you get when you talk about this with people a lot is you also get, well, if I eat the genes of a carrot, will I become a carrot? Will they get into me somehow? Will I become a carrot? The answer is no. Every living thing that you eat, everything you eat is a living thing and contains DNA, right? Because it's a plant or it's an animal, well, it's got its own DNA. All that happens is you digest that DNA and you use the parts to build more you, right? It's incredibly difficult to get DNA into organisms, right? To get a new bit of DNA into organisms. So of course you won't, right? So that DNA is then incorporated for the golden rice bit, the beta-carotene is incorporated into the rice's DNA. And once you eat the rice, well, it gets broken down in the same way as the rest of the rice's DNA does, okay? So, obviously a very good bit of science, but does it work? Has it worked, okay? Well, there's actually no way to say. There's been so much protest, so much panic and so much fear about genetically modified crops that there's not enough approval in enough countries to get a firm answer, okay, on this problem. So, the promise of golden rice has really not been fulfilled due to this kind of legislative angle, okay? The problem, of course, goes like this, okay? Once you've got people who are absolutely adamantly against something, right, like genetic modified crops, what you get is a high burden of proof. People need to be shown that something is safe to eat or manufacture or whatever it might be, or use in medicine. So you need to test them, you need to do tests. But every time you try to test the GM crop, protesters will turn up and try and basically make it impossible to do any testing. Okay, so fields of experimental crops get destroyed by protesters, as we saw at the beginning. Politicians pass laws to appease lobbyists who are anti-GM, and so on and so forth. Okay, so therefore you can't demonstrate that your crop is safe. You can't learn. You can't get any new science. Okay. And so therefore people remain wary. Oh, it wasn't proven. You can't prove anything. So people stay wary. So therefore you need to do more tests and experiments. And so the horrible cycle goes on. So golden rice hasn't really fulfilled the promise that it could, because of this very human, very political angle rather than the science one. Okay? But some other examples where genetic modification has been used and is being used to produce lots of things is herbicide resistance in soybeans. If you can engineer a crop plant to be resistant to one particular herbicide that none of the other weed plants, weed species in the area are resistant to, you can use that one herbicide on your crop. It will kill off all the other ones, right, and leave your crop there. Now, you might think we shouldn't be using any herbicides at all, and that's a perfectly reasonable point of view. If you're one for the organic lobby, that's absolutely fine, right? There are good, solid arguments for that. But this genetically modified approach would reduce the amount of herbicide regularly used in total, because it would basically mean you could be incredibly selective about what you used, but it will only target the things that aren't your crop. Brilliant. Same thing with insecticide production, right? So corn that produces its own insecticide, right? So when a pest, an aphid or a mayfly, whatever, comes along to try and sort of predate on that, or sort of be a pest on your crop, it only gets a dose of insecticide if it bites into your crop plant, right? Which means you are not then spraying insecticides into the environment, into the general area. Okay. Now, obviously, there's a big advantage to that, because you're not hitting other insects that you want to survive. Okay. So if your corn isn't making it itself, virus resistance in plums, all that kind of stuff. Now, the general rule seems to be, if it's a product that's being fed to animals, or if it's a product that's being used to manufacture fibers for clothing or for medicine, people seem to be fine about it. But there's something about food, right, which speaks to what I've been saying in previous videos about how important we think food is. Okay, so let's talk about another thing. It's not genetic modification, right, but is another biotech success in food. Okay, and that is the production of this stuff, right? This is meat substitute. This is corn. Okay, now corn is a brand name. It's basically mycoprotein formed from a fungi called Fusarium fungi. Okay, and that's basically what we're going to talk about here. Look, so vegetarian substitutes like corn, you basically get a big bunch of fungal cells from this Fusarium species, and you put them in a big vat and you feed them on glucose syrup, starch in aerobic conditions. You bubble a lot of air through and you grow them up, and they produce this mycoprotein solid. You then basically tap that off, dry it, compact it, flavour it, and then you can sell it as a meat substitute. Okay. The crucial thing that's on your syllabus here is this new word mycoprotein. Mycoprotein obviously is the bit that actually provides the protein and replaces the meat in people's diets. Okay. It's a protein-rich food for vegetarians. So obviously, corn has gone from strength to strength in my lifetime. When it came out, it was quite high in fat. It didn't taste great, all that kind of stuff, and it's got better and better and better and better, and become this sort of a routine part, I would say, of people's diets, which is good, right? However, like everything, you've got to ask a couple of questions, right? So it is a fungi here, look, so this is where it would naturally be found, growing on an ear of corn. Then obviously that's it under a microscope with its long, what's called hyphae, so that's how fungi grows out, and it makes these furry patches on agar dishes here. So look back at your cell structure stuff to learn about fungal structure, because you have to know a bit about that. And this is sort of the process. So you've got a big industrial fermenter here. Now we're not going to use a paddle or a stirrer because those hyphae would get broken. We're using air being bubbled through, of course, because it's an aerobic process. Raw materials go in, you keep this warm, or usually because there's so much respiration going on in there, your job is actually keeping it cool. So you regulate the temperature, you regulate the raw materials going in, right, bubbling the air through to keep it mixed. Then there's a law that we have to reduce the amount of RNA, which is relative to DNA. So you've got to reduce the amount of nucleic acids. So that's done in the next stage. You then centrifuge the solids out, so spin, 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 so the solids sink to the bottom and the water gets purified and recycled. Then you chill the material left, and that's your raw mycoprotein from which you flavour and season and make corn. Okay, and then obviously off it goes into the shops, into the supermarkets, and so on and so forth, right? And that is basically how it's manufactured. Obviously, you might think this is brilliant because, of course, this tiny little fermenter here is going to take up far less space, for example, than a field of soybeans or other vegetarian protein-rich source, protein-rich crop, right? You might take that, or you might think, oh, my food's being made from fungal waste in a big industrial vat. Oh, that doesn't feel very natural. See earlier comments, right? And again, your opinion on that is your own. But obviously these are ways of manufacturing food that can diversify the food that we eat. So here's another example of an industrial fermenter. Lots of things are made like this. This one does have stirring paddles in the middle to make sure that the nutrient distribution is even. So we wouldn't use this one for Fusarium because it would break those hyphae. We would use it for something bacterial. Something like the production of insulin from genetically modified bacteria. So if we bring these together, this industrial fermentation thing and genetic modification, right? Something like insulin is actually now produced by bacteria in a fermenter like this. And then you may well get a diagram like this in a GCSE exam, and you'll be asked to interpret usually data around it, usually sort of questions and sort of graphs and charts of nutrients moving up, moving down, so on and so forth, right? So I would raise this question though. So it sounds all lovely, and a lot of vegetarians swear by corn, and it's great. I mean, I quite like some of the corn now. It's much, much better than it used to be, right? But the question is this actually environmentally better? Because how do you feed the Fusarium? I said it gets fed on cornstarch or glucose syrup. Where does that come from? Okay, if we massively upscaled this production, right, what's the impact of this fungal food? Where's that come from? Have we shipped it across the world like our sort of food miles issue from a few videos back? What's the carbon footprint of this? Okay, now undoubtedly it's more efficient gram for gram protein wise than growing cows or something like that, because of course there's loads of bits of cows we don't eat. They need lots more space, they produce lots of methane, lots of other waste products. But is it better than just having protein rich crops from a field? Okay, you might decide it is, you might decide it isn't. Okay, so we don't need to go into that too much. But as I said, GM in medicine is also mentioned on your syllabus. The idea of insulin production is about since 1994-ish. Everyone who's diabetic, type 1 diabetic, has been using this insulin that's generated, actual human insulin generated from modified bacteria. The way that works is illustrated in this diagram here, look, right? So you don't need to know too much detail at this stage. That comes in at A level. But we've got our human cell up here, out of which we cut the DNA. Okay, so we find the insulin gene and we cut that out. Don't worry about how, that's for A level. Okay, we then take that gene and we splice it into a little thing called a plasmid, which you should remember from your structure of bacterial cells. We take our bacteria, we take a plasmid, we splice our insulin gene in, and then we get that plasmid back into our bacteria. Okay, again, don't need to worry about how. There are other videos on this channel you can watch in the Biotech Basics playlist, which go into great detail for A-level standard, how you do all these processes, right? And then you would grow that in an industrial fermenter, and the bacteria would produce the insulin for you. Now, before this was a possibility, since between 1994 and 1911, where Banting and Best in Toronto, Canada, first discovered that it was insulin that was controlling diabetes. They first put it into a human, a guy called Leonard Thompson, who was a 13-year-old in 11-year-old, something like that, in 1913. Basically showed that he was could be the first insulin-controlled diabetic. Everyone from then up to 1994 used insulin from blended animal pancreases, which obviously wasn't human insulin exactly, had variations in its concentration depending on what the animal was producing when it was slaughtered, and generally people would have issues perhaps with using a product from pigs or sheep or cows or whatever it might be. Okay, so this is actually clean, reliable human insulin generated for us with a bacteria, and you don't tend to get the huge objections that you get with genetically modified food, which I think is very interesting. Okay, so what's the conclusion then, right? What have we come down on here, right? What have we actually learned? Well, basically, I would say don't be scared of lab coats. Okay, genetic modification I see as just an extension of farming. Okay, yes, we have to be very, very careful about how we use this technology and how we use gene editing techniques and so on and so forth, but we've also got to be careful about the extent to which we selectively breed animals. Right? We've got to be about the diversity that we're leaving on our farms and monocultures and so on and so forth. It's all part of one bigger picture. Okay. natural doesn't mean anything on its own. Or can I have that? Is it natural? It literally doesn't mean anything. And I think now I've pointed this out to you, probably that's going to, hope that's going to irritate you as much as it irritates me. Okay? And if we don't test stuff, we don't know stuff. So while I have a huge amount of sympathy for a lot of the environmental charities and movements out there, I think they do absolutely great work, sometimes their stance on this is a little bit short-sighted, I would say. If you don't test, you don't know. There is no way we can prevent, and there's no way we should try and hold back knowledge, right? Information. How we apply it, that obviously is another conversation. But the knowledge, right, I think we need, okay? And my favourite quote we're going to end on here, and hopefully if there's something I've got across to you in all of these videos on this channel, is that your lack of knowledge of science is not an argument against it. You need to be open-minded enough to assimilate new ideas, to take new ideas onto yourself, and basically, if they conflict with some view that you've got, well, that might mean that you need to adjust the view that you've got very slightly. Okay? And that's an important bit of being a scientist. It's an important bit of being intellectually honest and academically flexible. Okay, and that is the end of the GCSE. So as I say, all the references for this will be in the description. But thank you very much, right? Thank you very much for watching. Good luck with any GCSE exams that you have. And as my students are always asking me to say, like and share, subscribe to the channel for more excellent biology videos. Thank you very much. Good luck, and do watch some of the other videos on the channel. Bye-bye.